Hello, everyone. Yet once again, it's another day of fresh grace and mercy. This is the Guilt, Grace, Gratitude podcast, where we bridge the gap to Reformed Christian theology for your listening pleasure. Today is a promises and fulfillments episode. We're on chapter 18 in the Covenant Theology book, which is published by Crossway. It's written by Reformed Theological Seminary staff and faculty. This chapter 18, is written by Dr. Bruce Baugus, and it is on covenant theology in the Dutch Reformed tradition. It is in part 2, historical theology, but today, to help us with this chapter, we have none other than Reverend Danny Hyde from Oceanside, URC, which is Peter's pastor. We'll introduce here in a moment, and he's definitely an expert on this chapter, and he can walk us through it. The show notes that we have on this episode is the Society of Reformed Podcasters. There's a link there. You can find other like-minded podcasts out there. So if you really enjoy the content of our podcast, you'll probably enjoy theirs as well. There's also a few links to find a Reformed church near you. If nothing else, this is the most important thing, to find a local church to call home. There's also a link to Peter's church coming up in next summer, Santa Ana Reformed. So you can find out more information about that church if you're in the Orange County area. And then you can, of course, find a link to Crossway to get this book from Covenant Theology, and maybe some more other information about Reverend Hyde. And let's jump in and talk to Dr. Danny.
or soon to be Dr. Danny, right?
Hopefully.
Oh my gosh. Sorry about that.
No, it's fine. Yeah, as long as I can persevere and have enough energy, I'll be
That's
done.
right. He's in the candidacy phase. I think you just submitted like your last draft or something like that.
Yes, I mean, I've called it the last draft many times, and apparently it keeps getting resurrected. So
that's right. Yeah.
There we go.
That's true. Well, cool.
Close.
Yeah. Thanks for coming on to talk about Dutch Reformed theology. And you've written a couple commentaries on this. So we figured who else better than somebody we know to go on the show.
Yeah, well, goedemiddag, good afternoon.
If you're Dutch, I'm sure you know what that means.
Hey, that's appropriate. Kick off the episode with some Dutch.
We'll just have Danny speak in Dutch the entire time. We'll have no idea what's going on, but some people might.
Love it. So yeah, Peter, this is your pastor. Let's open it up and have you kind of introduce the audience to him.
Yeah, well, if you guys listened to an episode last year on the Reformed Church, Reformed Worship, we had Reverend Hyde talk about that, but he's the pastor of Oceanside United Reformed Church in Carlsbad, California, and he's got a couple degrees, one from the school that I go to, Westminster Seminary, California. He's an adjunct professor at a couple seminaries, writing his dissertation on John Owen. So if you want to know a little bit about John Owen, you can talk to him. But we were excited because he's, like I said, he's written a couple commentaries on this. And so we're going to go through kind of on a topical level on this chapter. We'll kind of dive deep at certain points. I think like a 30,000 foot flyover with a couple touchdown points as we go through this chapter. So, I mean, kind of first overall, what got you into kind of the Dutch Reformed Church, the Dutch Reformed tradition, kind of before we jump into this chapter?
Well, I'm a wild olive shoot grafted in.
Right, yeah.
I'm not Dutch, so I'm not much. Yeah, well, I mean, basically, people who know my story, I was a Pentecostal youth pastor in OC, Orange County, and I was a college student. And, I started listening to White Horse Inn back in the good old days.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I have so many great memories of those days. And Ken Samples, he used to be a Sunday school teacher, adult Sunday school at Christ Reformed Anaheim. He came to campus and did like a alternative chapel. Like we had a big praise and worship chapel where you got slain in the spirit and you had the revival and stuff.
That's right. Yeah.
And enough of us students were told the campus pastor, hey, can we get another chapel here? With some actual teaching. And so I don't even know how they found Ken. But they found Ken Samples. I think it's because he taught philosophy at local Christian colleges and junior colleges too. So he did like an alternative chapel with 10 of us, maybe not even that. he did it like on like St. Augustine and a few other figures from history. And it was just interesting, like, hey, here's this guy here who's like bringing, some historical, interesting theological, philosophical discussions.
Mm-hmm.
So, he invited me to church, and, whenever I had a chance to get away from youth pastoring, I would go to Christ Reformed Anaheim. And so that was like my first getting my toes wet into the Reformed world, and, meeting Kim and Mike. So that's how I made my way into that little world. And then I went off to seminary. I went to Westminster, drove down the coast, hung a left on Highway 78. And I was like, where am I going? This is as far from the beach as I ever lived.
That's right.
I can't feel the breeze out here. It's hot air, not cool beach air like I'm used to. So I went to Westminster, and I was, my wife and I weren't married yet. So I lived for 1 year at like Westminster in Escondido, and she lived in Orange County. And I also had a roommate, this Dutch guy, Johannes Clampinus, John Clampin. And he introduced me to the Dutch Reformed and made my way into the Reformed Church, into a Christian Reformed Church, which became the United Reformed Church. So and then went off to finish seminary, and then planted a church here in Oceanside, and that's all she wrote. So that's kind of how I made my way into it. So
nice.
Love it. Yeah.
The strange world of the Dutch, this weird outsider guy,
Yeah, it's not where I expected to be, but it's where I'm at.
I was like the shortest male in the congregation, that's
now you're the
crazy.
tallest.
When you're 6'4". Yeah, when you're 6'4",
right.
It's pretty nuts. Yeah.
But
now I'm the second tallest. My son passed me
up.
up.
It's weird.
Yeah.
But it's because they got like dairy and milk and all that stuff running through their bones.
A lot of calcium. Yeah, a lot of calcium.
Grow like shoots.
Your church, Oceanside URC, was the very first Reformed service that I went to.
I think that's what Peter said. I mean, that was like, gosh, it seems like forever ago.
Yeah, it was like
it was
well over a year ago.
Yeah. I don't even remember, honestly. The last year and a half's in a blur. So
it's probably like a year and a half, 2 years ago. Yeah. And then now
it's probably like 2 years ago.
Yeah. And the church I'm at now is great. It's an OPC. It's in Dana Point area, and love it. And my pastor.
Yep. Oh yeah.
Yeah. So it's good stuff. So with this chapter in the book, just to kind of open it up, could you help us kind of take the audience maybe back in time to where and when this was, this chapter? Because the previous chapter before this was post-Reformation developments. And now we're walking into specifically the Dutch Reformed tradition.
Yeah.
Maybe some important names and what's going on, like why this chapter? Why is this plugged into the book?
So what's interesting about the chapter, and just in general, is like when we say the word Dutch Reformed, like we think of the Netherlands today, tiny little country in northwest Europe. But we have three confessions of faith: the Heidelberg Catechism, Belgian Confession, Canzadort. And the Heidelberg Catechism was written in German and Latin. It was later translated into Dutch, so it's not a native Dutch thing. And so like we say Dutch, like in the context of Reformation, like it's the Low Countries, the lowlands, which is like the modern day country of the Netherlands, plus the modern day country of Belgium, plus Luxembourg, plus like parts of northern France. So it's like 17 independent little provinces that made up the Low Countries. So we have the Heidelberg Catechism. That's part of our Dutch Reformed, confessional heritage, although it's not, it didn't originate in the Netherlands or in a Dutch speaking context. The Belgic Confession is closer. It's written in French by a guy named Guy Debray, who is a pastor in what's today like northern France, southern Belgium. In those days would have been called the Lowlands, the Low Countries, the Netherlands. So the only confession that we have that, actually was written in what we would consider the Netherlands would be the Canzadort. So it's kind of interesting. So we talk about, the Dutch Reformed tradition. We mean Heidelberg Catechism, Belgian Confession, Canzadort.
Yeah.
But two of the three of those, like, they're not written in what we consider like today, the Netherlands, or in Dutch. So, so be it. So yeah, it's helpful chapter, good summary, like overview. Just there's lots of key names and key people. We'll come to the confessions probably here, just because that's a little simpler, but like two of the key names. There's a great sort of like intra Reformed squabble in the 1600s between two men. One Johannes Coxeus, and then the other was Hysbertus Futsius. If you see it in English, it looks like it says,
which they don't look
Futsius,
anything
right?
like that on the paper, but
yeah,
it's how you pronounce it.
Yeah. So in English, his name's Gilbert Foot.
Which is exactly how Nick pronounced it. I was like, that's what it looks like. But
so it just sounds cooler in Dutch. Hysbertus, or it's Latin. It's Latinized Dutch, Hysbertus Futsius. So so those two guys were very, very influential, very powerful writers, preachers, theologians, professors. And so this chapter gives a good summary of their positions, their views, and just in general, like Coxeus, he emphasized the discontinuities in the covenants, just kind of put it in simple terms for the average person out there. Like the discontinuity, the differences between the old and the new, right? Whereas Futsius wants to emphasize the continuities, like how things are similar, like how there's one covenant of grace. They both are speaking, true theology. They're both talking about, true concepts, and they're exegeting scripture and trying to come through, into some clarity on this. But they're just coming at the issue of covenant theology, quote unquote, from their own particular, from a different angle, right? So one of them's looking at, how there's one covenant of grace, that's why you baptize kids, right? And all this stuff. Other one's saying like, well, there's a lot of discontinuities. There's like this interesting, distinction that Coxeus brings out in the book of Hebrews, and also in Romans, two different Greek words, the parasis and the aphasis, passing over and remitting, or forgiving.
Yeah.
So, Coxeus says, oh, well, like that's a good, helpful distinction, because in the old covenant, Christ hasn't come yet. And so sins are passed over, right? Until they're remitted and forgiven when the cross happens. So Futsius looks at that and says like, hey, well, then that endangers the doctrine of justification by faith alone, because you're saying that the ancient saints weren't justified because if Christ hasn't come and their sins are only passed over. So like you can see like they start to get in a big war. They're both talking about similar things. They're just coming at it from different angles, and they're trying to be sensitive to like their own context and so forth. I mean, and I would just, a person out there who wants to maybe delve in some more. I mean, anybody gets this book, it's massive, right? It's like 600 something pages. So
yeah, it's
if you
7 months of podcasting. If you plow
through this thing, kudos to you. You've done a great job. If you want to delve into sort of like I don't want to call it definitive, but like a good Dutch Reformed view of covenant theology, there's a big 2-volume hardcover, I think it might be in paperback now, that Reformation Heritage Books publishes by Herman Vitzius.
Oh yeah. Yep.
And it's called The Economy of the Covenants. The Economy of the Covenants. I've got it on my shelf. Somewhere here.
Oh yeah, that was one of the first Reformed books I'd ever read.
Well, for those who might happen to watch these, I have the old classic like blue covers.
Yep.
So Vitzius or Witzius, The Economy of the Covenants. It's a good. He was sort of like a mediating figure in the Netherlands, trying to bring together like the Coxeus, emphases, and the Futsius emphases, trying to unify the church and say, hey, we're not really, this is a big, this is like an intramural debate. Like this is not like two different Reformed groups. We're all the same. We're brothers. Let's kind of, put our heads together and figure this out. So anybody wants to delve in a really deep way, like that's kind of like the deep end, lots of Hebrew, lots of Greek, lots of Latin, and a lot of it's translated, but helps you to understand like the flow of the flow of history from a good Dutch Reformed, position. So
Yeah. So like situating ourselves into this too. So these are major figures, but so I know the Synod of Dort came before some of these major figures. So like what's the context around? So like why do they need the synod in the Netherlands at this time?
The Synod of Dort, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, that's, it's not exactly the same like discussion, but it does deal with covenant issues. But the Synod of Dort, right? It's the years 16, 18, and 19. There's been a debate in the Netherlands, but also it's a debate in England. There's a debate in Spain amongst Roman Catholics on the issues of grace and the will. What role does free agency, the power of the will, and so forth have in context of God's grace? And so the Synod of Dort was trying to deal with a very particular issue. The followers of James Arminius, and they had 5 points. So like we talk about the so-called 5 points of Calvinism. Those are just responses to the 5 points of the Remonstrants, mm-hmm. or the Arminian party, those who protested. So they're the ones that had 5 points. Like we have the Heidelberg Catechism, 129 questions, Belgian Confession, 37 articles. Like we have a huge theology. Like we have every topic under the sun. They summarize their thing down to 5 points, right? So like I'm a big advocate of we don't want to boil it down to 5 points. Like this is this overly simplified thing, right? Mm-hmm. And then what happens, that gets kind of severed from its context 400 years ago, and then all of a sudden everybody today thinks, well, if you hold to the 5 points of Calvinism, you're a hardcore fire breathing Calvinist guy. And then a guy like me, whose brain lives in the 16th, 17th century, I'm you only have 5 points. What are you talking about? So anyways, yeah. So those canons of Dort, the Synod of Dort is dealing with the issue of grace and the human will, the fall, the Holy Spirit's work, the death of Christ, predestination, these big sort of theological issues that all boil down to what is God's grace? How does God's grace operate and do it? And, how does God do his thing, with grace?
Yeah. Cause Baugus talks a little bit about the canons of Dort. And so a little bit so how are the canons of Dort and the Synod of Dort? How are those related? Are they the same thing, or is that how does it go into each other?
The Synod, right? The Synod is just a big meeting. That's what a Synod is, a big gathering in a town called Dort, or Dordrecht in Dutch. And the canons with one N, right? Not two N's. Two N's means it's
not
a
boom
gun.
Cannon, but
not a gun, but a theological canon, like a rule of faith. So the canons are the product of the Synod of Dort. So yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. This chapter mentions the three forms of unity a few times. Could you bring that up and how that's relevant to this?
Sure. Yeah. So the three forms of unity, those are the three confessions I've already mentioned: the Belgic Confession, Heidelberg Catechism, and the canons of Dort. And they're these at the Synod of Dort, these became the three confessional documents of the Reformed churches of the Netherlands. Before that, it was just Heidelberg Catechism and Belgian Confession. So these are the three standards, the three theological, foundational documents for our little tradition of churches. And they talk about covenant issues, and they talk about it in particular, dealing with sacraments like baptism and communion.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and then with the canons and all these things too. And so the last chapter talked on the Westminster Confession of Faith. So I'm assuming some people are like, well, so is there a difference? What's the difference? Why does one area have one confession, another area has another confession?
Sure. People got to realize, at the time of the Reformation, there was a phrase in the period of the medieval and then into the Reformational period that says basically whoever ruled a region, that's the religion of the region. So whoever the ruler was, that was the religion. So if your prince, if your king, if your emperor was, a Roman Catholic, you were a Roman Catholic. If he became a follower of Martin Luther, then, you were a quote unquote Lutheran. And then, as the Reformation spreads, if you were, you were a Protestant, but you weren't quite a Lutheran on various key issues, well, then you were Reformed. So that's going on in the background. And so every like little prince and principality and region and, group of, sort of national group. We don't think there's no nationalism back then, but every like regional area has its own ruler and its own sort of theological persuasion. So every area then Protestant wrote their own confession of faith, because they're testifying. It's not just like they're saying, hey, we have our own peculiarity of doctrine here in like Zurich, the Swiss lands of Zurich, or over here in Basel, Switzerland, or in Strasbourg, we have our own like cool theological insights. No, they're trying to testify. It was a way of, that's what a confession was. It was a public statement to the king, to the Holy Roman Emperor, to the Pope, to the world. Like, this is what we believe. And if you read through the Reformed confessions, and there are hundreds of them, you'll see like there's so much unanimity. It's not even funny. Like, they're all emphasizing the same things. Sure, there are little idiosyncratic things here and there, but and that's why some, like the three forms of unity, and then say like the Westminster Standards, like they become kind of like the main groups of confessions, because they're very biblical. They're very succinct. They're very powerful. Like, they just have a good quality to them, and they're used by more than just like those national churches. Like, they get spread across Europe and through missionary work. And they become like adopted by others. So yeah, like if you read the Westminster Standards and Three Forms of Unity, you'll see like obviously there's like a ton of unanimity. They say things maybe differently. They say things a little bit, maybe some are shorter than others. But that's why, because they had their own particular like national geographical, Reformation going on. And they like in the context of England, they wanted to write a confession that would emphasize, their unity with, Scotland, for example.
Gotcha.
Yep. So
here's a few names in here that I don't know if we mentioned yet that maybe you could shed some light on for the audience. Bavinck, Voss, and Berkhoff are mentioned on page 398, whether they are directly attached to the Dutch Reformed kind of tradition or just are involved some way. Could you maybe shed some light on those individuals?
Yeah, I mean, with names like Bavinck, Voss, and Berkhoff, you're definitely Dutch, that's for sure.
Yeah.
So yeah, these are like, these are key figures in 20th century, reformational thought. Herman Bavinck was a professor at my university. I'm rocking my sweatshirt today. My University of, there it is. I think you can see it in the camera. Yeah. My Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam sweatshirt. He was professor at Free University of Amsterdam. Obviously, people know him now because his works have been translated, and there's even more works being translated by him. Gerhardus Voss is an American. I mean, he's a Dutch guy, but he's Dutch American. Grew up in a Christian Reformed church and ended up in the OPC. Taught at Princeton. Louis Berkhoff taught at Calvin Seminary in Grand Rapids, which is the official seminary of the Christian Reformed Church. It's one of the two like main historic Dutch Reformed churches in the U.S. And I like to tell people, if you have a hard time reading, or if you're not a big reader and you look at Herman Bavinck's 4-volume Reformed Dogmatics, I just tell people get the 1-volume summary, which is Louis Berkhoff. So Berkhoff basically summarizes for an American Dutch Reformed context, Herman Bavinck.
Yeah, we're going through the wonderful works of God at Oceanside too.
Yeah. I mean, so Bavinck has his own like summary of it, but Berkhoff's like a little more like a systematic theological. It's a little simpler. It's like a little more structured. Yep.
Okay. And then this, I mean, if I'm pronouncing it right, for those who maybe have heard of it, the Nadere Reformatia. So what is that, and why is that in Dutch Reformed theology? The Nadere Reformatie. It just means a further Reformation.
And so it's basically, like, to put it in simple terms, it's like the Dutch version of English Puritanism. So, these are people that are in Dutch context, these are people who are in the national church, the Dutch Reformed Church, just like over in England, Puritans were those within the English church, the Church of England. And so they desired, as time goes on and, a whole nation is quote unquote reformed, and the best estimates that we have from our best scholars say that at the height of the Dutch Reformed Church, like 30% of the nation was actually church going. So, anybody that, wants to make Amsterdam great again or whatever, don't forget, like, at the height, 30%, right? So, and then, people like say, there's a lot of like bad stuff that comes out of like colonialism is bad, right? There's a lot of bad stuff that comes out of Europe. But a lot of times, it gets overly simplified as like, oh, well, the Dutch Reformed Church colonized X, Y, and Z. Well, the Dutch Reformed Church required preachers to go on ships across the world to have some, like, some sanctifying effect on sailors.
Exactly. The sailors
So
they need
it's a big
preachers.
mess. It's a big mess. So 30% of the population, is like church going, and so those preachers, theologians, and people, they want to see their nation like continue on in the Reformation. They want to see people converted. They want to see, they want to see the magistrate, the civil government, local and provincial and national. They want to see them guided by the word of God, right? This is the time where the church and state worked hand in hand. They want to see seminaries teaching, weeding out bad guys, weeding out bad students who aren't converted. So that sounds weird to us, but what they want to see is the Reformation continue. They don't want to see it just like calcify. They want to see it continue and people's lives are changed. So that's why it would be considered sort of like the Dutch Puritanism.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's kind of reforming the church from within.
Yeah, and in the end of the chapter, under conclusion, it does say that Dutch Reformed theologians tackled common and sometimes ancient philosophical, exegetical, and theological questions. So did they bring something to the table the other reformers before them and during them in other parts of the continent weren't really doing, that really was a unique impact for the church?
I guess I'm always leery of like overemphasizing like particular, like insights or, some like particular, like, so it like if you would talk to some of my friends in the Netherlands, and you would say like, oh, this great chapter on, Dutch Reformed Covenant Theology, they would be like, what's Dutch Reformed?
Okay.
Like, because they would say, like, there's nothing novel about our tradition. Like, we're Catholic, like we're in a small C, like we're Christians, we're Reformed, like we're part of an international movement. We're not. So I think we kind of like romanticize sometimes, like their own thing. So these theologians like Coxeus is trying to wrestle with the scriptural, like in Hebrews, like it sounds like there's a big difference between the Old and New Covenants. And so he's trying to wrestle with that, and these two different Greek terms that are used for passing over sins or remitting sins. So there's insights. So I guess the way you got to think about it is, there's confessional unity from the beginning of the Reformation to the end. I mean, until today, there's generally speaking confessional unity. But as time goes on, like, the reformers in the 1500s, they're starting to like learn Greek, right? They're starting to learn Hebrew. They're starting to like get all these manuscripts from the East, and they're getting, professors coming over. Like this is like in the Renaissance period, right? As Constantinople falls in 1486, like a lot of scholars from the East come west, right? And so they're bringing their manuscripts with them. And all of a sudden, like the Western church is no longer just reading Latin Bibles, they're reading Hebrew and Greek Bibles. But then you got to imagine 100 years later, like Calvin dies in 1564, like 100 years later, the middle of the 1600s, now they have even more manuscripts. All of a sudden they're discovering, like, you know, they're writing their own Hebrew and Greek grammars. They're no longer relying upon, like, you know, translations of translations. Now they have the originals, you know, and they're reading manuscripts, and the students have been trained for 100 years in how to read texts. So there's just much more, like, new. I wouldn't say like there's great bursts of insights. It's just there's more nuance. There's more, like, tools. Like, you know, I have my shelves behind me. I mean, I have so many tools at my disposal that John Calvin didn't have. Right? You know, I just got the new Cambridge Greek lexicon that goes through, like, the Septuagint and, like, all this, like, classical Greek, right? We have, like, our old Greek lexicons, but now we have this new one. That's like the first Greek lexicon that's come out in, like, I don't know, 100 years. Like, that's like, it's going to be a standard in, like, Greek studies, you know? You know, so yeah, there is, like, distinctiveness in terms of, like, just a continual, like, education and, like, and textual apparatus, and just the nuance that people have in the area of theology and exegesis and knowing languages. And so, yeah, you know, they're all dealing with the same questions. They're just more like sophistication, you know?
Yeah. So, and then my last question, if Nick has anything else to add after this, or if you want to kind of cap this off. So in this, the end of this kind of talks about with Berkhoff and Bavinck and kind of their enduring legacy within Dutch Reformed and today, but kind of bringing it to today. So why should we, as Christians, Reformed Christians, why should we, it sounds weird, but why should we care about Dutch reformers and their impact on today?
I mean, they have cool names, number one, you know? Yeah, I mean, this is the Dutch Reformed, you know, tradition is a part of the one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. It's one little branch, right? It's one little twig of a branch of a tree. And you know, it's produced great fruits, you know? So, you know, the theology, I would say the theology has been preserved in our three forms of unity that we talked about a few minutes ago. You know, we have a high view of, you know, what the sacraments are and preaching and worship. That's reverent, and that brings the gospel to Christians and unbelievers every single Sunday. You know, and we have a foundation. Like, there's just so many churches, there's so many options. Like, you know, churches like a drive-through today, right? And you have so many options, and like, and then all of a sudden, like, you know, Taco Bell and KFC are like in the same exact drive-through. This is like an abomination, you know.
Eat them at the same time. That would be terrible.
It's like, you know, you drive up, you're like in the middle of nowhere in the desert on the way to Vegas, you know, for some basketball tournament. You're really hungry, and you're like, oh, let's go to this Carl's Jr. And it's like Carl's Jr. / green burrito. It's like, come on, man. You know, like,
you're asking for stomach problems.
We just have so many options, right? It's like, church is sort of felt that way today and described that way, especially here in SoCal, right? Like church is just like an add-on, you know. It's like, and you go to the place where it has the best flavor and your favorite, you know, whatever your favorite thing is, and then you kind of bounce around. Like, yeah, the Dutch Reformed tradition is, as a part of the Holy Catholic Church, the Universal Christian Church, gives stability and, you know, doctrinal stability and a liturgical, worshipful stability, you know, and a very practical stability to our souls. It's like, you know, Heidelberg Catechism begins with that wonderful question: what's your only comfort in life and in death? It's that I belong body, soul, life, and in death to my faithful Savior Jesus Christ. And so that's the gospel, and that's what we try to proclaim, you know, every single week. So yeah, I would hope people would, you know, would see that as a valuable thing, and want to learn more, want to, you know, inquire more about, you know, how is this, you know, weird tradition like relevant for me today?
Yeah. Peter actually took my question, and it's good.
Annoyingly.
That's what happens when you're doing a podcast with somebody for over a year. You start thinking the same stuff. But just to peel back the onion on being extra practical about today, is it possible to be going to a Reformed church in 2021 and not experience any influences of the Dutch Reformed tradition? Is that possible?
Well, I mean, in our little federation of churches, no, because it's just, you know, it's in our liturgical like
It's in our DNA.
structure and our confession. So like all that stuff is kind of like in there, right? So yeah, in our tradition of churches, we're gonna definitely have, you know, we have the same confessions that, you know, they use at the Synod of Dort. We have the same like liturgical material that they used with some more as well. But a lot of the, you know, we have similar, we sing psalms, and so like they're translated into different language, different tunes perhaps, so like we're singing the same songs, and you know, even some of the hymns and so forth are similar in time. So there is that like that good faithful tradition that's been passed down that we try to make use of every single week.
For sure. And I know a lot of our audience could find it maybe even confusing if they're not part of a Reformed church and they're on the outside kind of looking in and thinking, man, you Reformed guys are so confusing with your acronyms, and I don't know which congregation.
What you mean, like WWJD and that kind of stuff, you know?
You know?
More like URC, OPC, Nate Park. Like, how do I know if I'm going to one of those and I'm getting Dutch Reformed theology, or if I'm just getting, you know, something else, or they all the same? That's what I think people that aren't Reformed are like, either like, I don't know, that's confusing, or why should I care? Or why is it important? That's probably what they're asking.
I mean, I would say to somebody, you know, anybody out there, you know, who's listening or who would ask me, you know, first and foremost, like, are you actually hearing every single week in preaching not just about Jesus, but you're hearing the voice of Christ to your soul, the gospel? You know, and if so, you know, rejoice, be thankful that you hear that every single week. But you know, as we all know, like, it's just hearing the gospel as good news for Christians. I'm not talking about like, you know, if an evangelistic sermon for the unbeliever, or, you know, a Billy Graham crusade, or, you know, a Harvest Crusade. I'm talking about like the gospel is preached every single week. In the whole, we would say in the whole liturgy, not just the sermon, the whole liturgy, the gospel comes to us. And that's why like the Reformed Church is relevant, because we see the gospel as central, like really central, not just as a slogan, you know, like a gospel coalition slogan, right? This is like a real deal, like for us, like this has been our tradition for 500 years. And so, you know, and then going back to the, you know, through the church's history, like the gospel in Christ are the center. It's in our theology. Like we, you know, we can mess it up, but our theology in our confessions and so forth, like they give us that theology, they give us that centrality that, you know, if we follow sort of quote unquote, if we follow the script, like we're not going to mess up. We mess up when we go off the script, right? And we do our own thing. We try to be cool and hipster and relevant and, you know, whatever, you know, whether it's like Smells and Bells or whether it's like hipster, like we go down the path of like our own like demise, as opposed to preaching the gospel, you know, singing and praying in a way that honors God and brings glory to him, and that unites us, the church in heaven and earth. And you know, tries to bring that to the world, you know.
Yeah. So last thing before we end out, we always give a guest an opportunity to kind of promote their stuff. So I know you have a book that just came out recently, or it's the second edition. And then where can people find you? What else have you written on that could be helpful for this topic too? Yeah, people, I mean, you can find all my books. I mean, I have a website, danielrhyde.com. That's just my website, but you know, you can find all my books on Amazon. The latest thing that was published, second edition of a book that I guess we'll talk about down the road here. What's the title of that thing again? God with us. Yeah. Yep. God with us. I wrote the thing a long time ago. And then so that's a book on like, what is the incarnation? Like, what does it mean to say that Jesus is God, right? The word became flesh. What does that mean? How has the church understood that in history? Why is it relevant for us? Why is it so central to the gospel? So God with us, that's the latest thing. Like I said, it's on Amazon, my website, danielrhyde.com. You can find me there. You can find me online, all the normal places as well. So as far as what I'm working on, trying to finish my dissertation, hopefully by the turn of the new year. That'll be in the, like, I'll be looking towards that that sunlight, that light at the end of the tunnel. The tunnel gets bigger and the light gets bigger. And then I think it's next week,
maybe you guys can promote this for me when it comes out. But I have a little 3-part series that's going to be published on Table Talk magazine, like their online Table Talk online. I think it's just Table Talk magazine is the website. Ligonier's Table Talk. I have a 3-part series going through the book of Romans, chapter number 8, just chapter 8 in three like sort of, they were originally sermons, and then I did like a conference one time, and I turned them into like a kind of like a blog post, fairly substantial, dealing with the doctrine of assurance of faith, the assurance of salvation. And so that'll be, I think, next week. Okay. And that'll be on, assurance is a Christ-centered reality. It's a pneumatological, spirit-centered reality, and also it's an eschatological, an end goal, right, reality. So those are my 3 articles coming out next week for Ligonier Table Talk. So yeah.
Nice. Yeah. And you guys will see this. We haven't recorded yet, but you guys will see the book published in the episode sometime in December. So cool. if you want to read more of Pastor Hyde's stuff that's coming out, if you want to go to the church, you're in the San Diego kind of North County area, Oceanside URC, and you're on, was it Daniel R. Hyde is your Twitter handle and all that other stuff?
Yep.
Cool. Yep. Well, thanks for coming on. Thanks for talking about Dutch Reformed theology with us. It was a pleasure, and I'll see you on Sunday.
All right. God bless.
Thank you.
Thanks.